Dive into the high-stakes world of political corruption with Karoline Leavitt as she battles shadowy powers and exposes a bribery empire. Like, subscribe, and comment to join Karoline Now's relentless pursuit of truth and justice in America's most explosive confrontations. Silence falls like a weighted curtain across the Manchester courtroom. The wood-paneled chamber, with its high ceilings and atmosphere of aged authority, becomes the stage for what will soon ignite as the opening salvo in America's most explosive corruption scandal. Karoline Leavitt sits perfectly poised at the witness stand. The former White House press secretary's composure betrays nothing of the storm gathering within her. Across the room, Judge Gerald Harrington studies her with thinly veiled contempt, his gavel resting beneath manicured fingers that have signed countless controversial rulings. Mrs. Riccio, Harrington emphasizes the surname with deliberate mockery. Or do you prefer Leavitt when convenient for your professional endeavors? The judge's insinuation hangs in the air, a calculated attempt to undermine her credibility by highlighting her marriage to Nicholas Riccio, whose family fortune spans generations of American industry. Ms. Leavitt, for professional matters, Your Honor, Karoline responds, her voice steady despite the deliberate provocation. Though I fail to see how my marital status relates to the evidence I've been called to present. The courtroom ripples with tension. Spectators shift in their seats, reporters' pens hover expectantly above notepads. This is no ordinary testimony. Karoline Leavitt comes armed with documents, financial records, correspondence, and sworn statements, all suggesting the organization known as Liberty Vanguard functions less as the civic-minded foundation it claims to be, and more as an elaborate funding network for judicial bribes and political manipulation. Judge Harrington's knuckles whiten around his gavel. This court won't be lectured on relevance by a witness with obvious political motivations. The evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor, Karoline counters, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Harrington's growing agitation. The financial transfers detailed in Exhibit C demonstrate a pattern that cannot be dismissed as coincidental. From the gallery, Jasmine Carter, an investigative journalist whose work first connected several suspicious Liberty Vanguard donations, catches Karoline's eye with a subtle nod. They both understand the stakes. What begins today reaches far beyond this courtroom, threatening a power structure that has operated in Manchester's shadows for decades. The judge's authority, the public's perception, Karoline's reputation, all hang in precarious balance as she opens the folder before her. The first document emerges, a canceled check bearing Judge Harrington's signature, made out to an offshore entity connected to 3 dismissed cases against Liberty Vanguard donors. Let the record show, Karoline begins, her voice gaining strength as cameras capture what will soon dominate national headlines, that on September 12, Judge Gerald Harrington deposited $175,000 into account number 8547-32J at Grand Cayman First National, one day after dismissing corruption charges against Liberty Vanguard's founder. The courtroom erupts. Harrington pounds his gavel with thunderous fury, but the damage is done. The battle lines of a war that will consume Manchester's power elite have been drawn in the stark fluorescent light of Courtroom 7. Karoline Leavitt has just lit the fuse on an explosive that threatens to demolish decades of carefully constructed corruption, and Judge Harrington's reddening face reveals he knows it all too well. The Manchester courthouse steps, bathed in the harsh glare of afternoon sun, become Karoline Leavitt's war room as she exits the building. The confrontation inside was merely the opening gambit in a game with stakes higher than anyone yet realizes. Karoline unfolds a manila envelope withdrawn from her leather portfolio, spreading documents across the hood of her car while keeping one eye on the courthouse entrance. Financial records, offshore accounts, shell companies, a labyrinthine network of corruption slowly taking shape before her. Liberty Vanguard isn't a civic organization, she whispers to herself. It's a laundering operation. The papers reveal a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. Millions funneled through shell companies, each transaction coinciding with favorable rulings from Judge Harrington's court. Companies winning contracts they never bid for. Development projects approved despite failing environmental standards. Competitors mysteriously disqualified on technicalities. Karoline knows she needs allies, people with resources, courage, and access to information beyond her reach. That evening, in the quiet corner of a downtown cafe chosen specifically for its poor surveillance potential, Karoline meets Jasmine Carter, an investigative journalist whose work on corporate corruption earned her both respect and enemies. "These are serious allegations, Karoline," Jasmine says, her eyes darting between the documents and the cafe entrance. "Harrington has friends in every branch of government. He's untouchable." "No one is untouchable with enough evidence," Karoline replies, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Liberty Vanguard's financial records for the past 5 years. I need someone to cross-reference these against Harrington's case history." Jasmine's expression shifts from skepticism to determination as she reviews the preliminary evidence. "There's a pattern here," she murmurs, tracing connections between dates and dollar amounts. 2 days later, their nascent investigation gains unexpected momentum when David Walsh, a former Liberty Vanguard accountant, reaches out through an encrypted message. "I have what you're looking for, but we need to meet somewhere safe." They're watching. The meeting occurs in an abandoned warehouse on Manchester's industrial edge. David arrives with a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, his eyes haunted by fear. "I kept copies of everything," he explains, unlocking the case to reveal meticulously organized financial records. Account numbers, wire transfers, names of judges, politicians, police captains, everyone on Liberty Vanguard's payroll. "Why now?" Karoline asks, studying the man's face for signs of deception. "Because they killed my predecessor when he threatened to talk," David responds, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heart attack at 42, no history of cardiac problems. I'm not waiting to be next." As Karoline and her growing network of allies piece together the evidence, the magnitude of the corruption becomes breathtaking. Liberty Vanguard's tentacles extend into construction contracts, municipal bonds, pharmaceutical approvals, and judicial appointments, a shadow government operating with impunity. But someone is watching. Lucas Cain, Judge Harrington's enforcer, appears with increasing frequency in the periphery of their investigation. A tall figure in an expensive suit outside Jasmine's apartment. A black SUV following Karoline after meetings. A break-in at David's home, where nothing is stolen but his laptop is mysteriously accessed. The warning becomes explicit one rainy evening as Karoline returns to her car after meeting with a potential whistleblower. A single white envelope rests beneath her windshield wiper. Inside, photographs, Karoline entering the courthouse, Jasmine interviewing sources, David at the cafe, Nicholas Riccio, Karoline's husband, at his office, each marked with a red X. The message requires no explanation. "They're trying to scare us off," Karoline tells Nicholas that night in their kitchen, carefully positioned away from windows, speaking softly, despite having swept for listening devices. "It means we're getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed." Nicholas takes her hand, his wealth and influence suddenly seeming fragile against the machinery they're confronting. "We knew this wouldn't be safe, Karoline. Just tell me you're being careful." "Careful doesn't win wars," she responds, spreading a new set of documents across their kitchen island. "We need to find out who Sentinel is." The name appears repeatedly in the financial records, a code name for someone at the top of the corruption hierarchy. Someone who can make judges, politicians, and business leaders fall in line. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar bribery network while remaining completely in the shadows. As the first act of this dangerous drama unfolds, Karoline Leavitt stands at the center of a gathering storm. The corruption network she's beginning to expose isn't merely a case of one corrupt judge or one compromised foundation. It's an entire parallel system of power operating behind Manchester's respectable façade. And somewhere in the shadows, watching her every move, waits the mysterious Sentinel, prepared to protect their empire at any cost. The evidence against Liberty Vanguard was mounting by the day, each new document strengthening the case Karoline Leavitt and her allies were building. But in the shadows of Manchester, darker forces were mobilizing against them. At precisely 9:17 p.m. on a moonless Tuesday, Karoline was reviewing documents in the underground parking garage of her law firm when the attack came. Lucas Cain emerged from between parked vehicles, his 6'4" frame moving with practiced efficiency. The first blow caught Karoline across the shoulder as she turned. "This is your final warning," Cain growled, his voice echoing against concrete walls. "Walk away, or the next time I finish the job." Karoline's response was to press the emergency alert on her phone, a signal to Nicholas Riccio, who had insisted on such precautions weeks earlier. Cain disappeared before security arrived, leaving Karoline bruised but more determined than ever. The physical threat, however, would prove less damaging than the betrayal already contaminating her inner circle. In Jasmine Carter's makeshift investigation hub, a converted warehouse space, fortified with security cameras and scrambling technology, the team gathered to assess their position. The financial records David provided trace back to 7 different shell companies, Jasmine explained, pinning documents to an evidence board, all ultimately connecting to Liberty Vanguard. Marcus Tate, the community activist whose neighborhood had suffered most under the corrupt development deals, studied the patterns. We're looking at systematic displacement of low-income families. Every project approved by Harrington's court resulted in gentrification. But as they strategized, Sarah Nguyen, Karoline's trusted legal advisor, quietly photographed key documents with a microscopic camera disguised as a lapel pin. Later that night, those images would find their way to Judge Harrington's private server. "They know too much," Harrington muttered while reviewing the intelligence in his study. "Sentinel won't be pleased." The betrayal revealed itself 3 days later when Leo Tran, the brilliant but reclusive hacker assisting Karoline's team, detected the breach. "Someone's been accessing our secure server from an external location," Leo announced during an emergency meeting. His fingers danced across multiple keyboards, pulling up access logs. The IP address traces to Sarah's home network. The revelation landed like a bomb among the allies. Eyes turned to Sarah, watching her composure crack under collective scrutiny. "They have my sister," she finally confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Harrington said they would hurt her if I didn't cooperate." The revelation fractured the group's fragile trust precisely when unity was most critical. Karoline had scheduled a press conference for the following week to release their findings publicly, a protective measure against further attacks. "We don't know who else might be compromised," David Walsh whispered, his former insider's paranoia resurfacing. "This could be a setup." For 48 tense hours, the alliance threatened to dissolve entirely. Marcus Tate argued for postponing the press conference. Jasmine Carter pushed to accelerate it before further leaks could occur. Karoline withdrew into strategic silence, weighing options while Nicholas increased security around their home. It was Anna Kessler, the federal auditor who had been quietly verifying their financial evidence, who provided the stabilizing force. "I've confirmed the authentication of every document," she stated firmly. "The evidence stands regardless of how it was obtained, or who might have seen it. The corruption is real, and it's extensive." Karoline emerged from her contemplation with renewed resolve. In her home office, swept twice daily for surveillance devices, she gathered her core team. "Sarah's betrayal is unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant," she told them. "Let Harrington and Sentinel think they've gained the upper hand. We'll compartmentalize information moving forward. Leo, create a parallel server with controlled misinformation." The hacker nodded, already conceptualizing the digital trap. "Jasmine, feed selected stories to competing outlets. Make them chase each other." "Division as distraction," the journalist noted with appreciation. "Marcus, accelerate community organizing. We need public support as a shield." The activist straightened. "The people of Manchester are ready to stand against corruption." With methodical precision, Karoline reconstructed her strategy. The physical attack had failed to intimidate her. The betrayal had failed to stop them. Now as Harrington and his unseen master sentinel waited for their opposition to crumble, Karoline Leavitt was instead converting these setbacks into tactical advantages. "They think they're watching us," she told her husband that night as they stood on their balcony, speaking over the sound of the wind to defeat any listening devices. "But we're the ones who see them clearly now." The battle lines were drawn. Karoline's evidence against Liberty Vanguard's corruption network was nearly complete, and despite the dangers multiplying around her, her resolve had never been stronger. In the pre-dawn hours of Manchester's most consequential morning, Karoline Leavitt stood at her kitchen window, watching the city lights flicker like distant warning signals. The press conference she had orchestrated wasn't just a media event, it was a declaration of war against corruption's entrenched machinery. Across town, Judge Gerald Harrington received Sarah Nguyen's latest intelligence report with growing agitation. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed a secure line. "She's moving forward," Harrington reported tersely. "Today at noon." The voice that answered belonged to Senator Robert Dawson, the shadowy figure known as Sentinel to his corrupt network. "Then we move forward to demonstrate the consequences of her persistence." At the abandoned textile factory that now served as their operational headquarters, Karoline's team performed final security sweeps. Leo Tran had established a technical perimeter that would detect surveillance attempts, while Marcus Tate coordinated with community volunteers, forming a protective human barrier around the venue. "We've confirmed attendance from 17 media outlets," Jasmine Carter announced, reviewing her tablet, "including 3 national networks." Karoline nodded, her composed exterior masking the storm within. "And the misinformation server?" "Online, and being actively monitored by Harrington's people," Leo confirmed with a slight smile. "They're downloading exactly what we want them to see." David Walsh, the Liberty Vanguard whistleblower, paced nervously. "I still say this is too dangerous. We should have released everything anonymously." "Anonymity gives them deniability," Karoline countered. "This corruption has flourished in darkness. We bring it into the light." At precisely noon, Karoline stepped before a forest of microphones. Behind her stood a unified front: Jasmine, Marcus, David, Ellen Brooks, and Anna Kessler, each representing different facets of a community betrayed by its own institutions. "For the past 5 years," Karoline began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "Liberty Vanguard Investments has systematically corrupted our judicial system, purchasing favorable rulings through a complex bribery network overseen by Judge Gerald Harrington. Across the city, in living rooms and offices, televisions displayed the unfolding revelation." Karoline methodically presented the evidence: financial transactions, recorded conversations, sworn testimonies, each piece fitting perfectly into a mosaic of corruption. "The displacement of families from the Riverside district was not an unfortunate consequence of progress," she continued. "It was the deliberate objective of a predatory development scheme rubber-stamped by a compromised court." As Karoline spoke, Lucas Cain moved through the crowd outside Nicholas Riccio's financial firm. The enforcer's presence was not coincidental, it was the first countermove in Sentinel's retaliatory strategy. "Mr. Riccio," Cain said, intercepting Nicholas as he exited the building, "your wife is making powerful enemies today." The threat hung in the air between them, neither subtle nor deniable. Nicholas squared his shoulders. "Deliver a message to your employers, Mr. Cain. Any action against my wife or our allies will trigger the immediate release of our complete evidence portfolio to federal authorities and international media." Meanwhile, the press conference transformed into something unexpected. What Karoline had planned as a controlled disclosure evolved into a spontaneous community uprising. Marcus Tate had positioned community members throughout the audience, and their testimonies of displacement and injustice electrified the gathering. "They took my home of 30 years through eminent domain," one elderly woman declared, her voice breaking. "Then I watched them build luxury condominiums, where my neighbors and I once lived." Harrington watched the broadcast with mounting horror as his carefully constructed reputation disintegrated in real time. His phone rang incessantly. Terrified associates, demanding investors, nervous politicians, all seeking assurances he could no longer provide. By nightfall, spontaneous protests had erupted throughout Manchester. What had begun as Karoline's calculated exposure had catalyzed into a movement. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered with hastily made signs, demanding Harrington's resignation and investigation. In Karoline's secure meeting room, her team monitored the fallout with cautious optimism. "The public response exceeds our projections," Anna Kessler noted, reviewing social media analytics. "Harrington's approval rating has dropped 27 points in 6 hours." But Ellen Brooks, whose insider knowledge of Liberty Vanguard made her acutely aware of their ruthlessness, offered a sobering perspective. "They won't surrender to public opinion, they'll escalate. Dramatically." The escalation began at 9:43 p.m. with simultaneous strikes. Jasmine Carter's apartment was ransacked, her research materials stolen. David Walsh discovered his financial accounts frozen. Marcus Tate's community center received eviction notices based on suddenly discovered code violations. Most alarmingly, Leo Tran detected sophisticated cyber attacks attempting to compromise their secure communications and evidence servers. "They're trying to isolate us from each other and from our proof," Karoline realized as the reports flooded in. Classic divide and conquer. In her home study, Karoline faced her husband Nicholas across a desk covered with contingency plans. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders, not just for their own safety, but for every ally who had risked everything by standing with her. "We always knew they would fight back," Nicholas reminded her gently. "The question is, do we retreat or advance?" Karoline's gaze drifted to the photograph of her grandfather, a civil rights attorney who had faced similar intimidation decades earlier. His words echoed in her memory. "Justice isn't achieved by those willing to fight only when it's safe to do so." "We advance," she answered, her resolution hardening into certainty. "But we adapt our strategy. From defense to offense." As midnight approached, Karoline drafted a message to her scattered allies, outlining their counter-response to Harrington and Sentinel's intimidation campaign. The press conference had been merely the opening move in a game with stakes higher than any of them had initially imagined. Not just corruption exposed, but a system transformed. Outside her window, the protests continued, a chorus of voices demanding accountability. Karoline knew that behind closed doors, Harrington and Sentinel were planning their most devastating countermoves. The true battle was only beginning, and its outcome would determine not just her fate, but the future of justice in Manchester itself. The Manchester County Courthouse stood as a temple of justice that morning, though its foundations had long been corrupted by the very man who presided within its chambers. Today, those foundations would be shaken to their core. Karoline Leavitt moved through the courthouse's marble corridors with the steady resolve of someone prepared for battle. Behind her walked a procession of allies, Jasmine Carter clutching documented evidence, Anna Kessler with financial audits, and David Walsh, visibly nervous but determined. They carried truth as their weapon into a system designed to suppress it. Inside the packed courtroom, Judge Gerald Harrington maintained his facade of judicial authority, his black robes a costume of legitimacy. His eyes betrayed a momentary flicker of concern when Karoline entered, but years of corruption had taught him confidence in his invulnerability. "The people are prepared to present evidence of judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy against Judge Gerald Harrington," Karoline announced, her voice carrying through the hushed chamber like a declaration of war. In the gallery, Nicholas Riccio observed with quiet intensity, while Marcus Tate had organized community members to witness justice unfold. The atmosphere crackled with tension. This wasn't merely a legal proceeding but the culmination of a community's fight against systematic exploitation. As Karoline methodically presented her case, the courtroom became a theater of revelation. Email correspondences between Harrington and Liberty Vanguard executives flashed on screens. Financial transactions appeared in meticulous detail, millions flowing through offshore accounts before returning as real estate investments in Manchester's redeveloped districts. These documents show 17 separate instances where Judge Harrington ruled in favor of Liberty Vanguard immediately following deposits to this account in the Cayman Islands, Karoline explained, her composure unwavering despite the gravity of her accusations. Harrington's attorney rose with practiced indignation. "These allegations are preposterous and based on circumstantial." Karoline interrupted by playing the first audio recording, Harrington's voice unmistakable as he discussed ruling outcomes with developers before trials had even begun. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A journalist in the third row began typing frantically. Even the court reporter paused momentarily, fingers suspended above her stenotype machine. Harrington's complexion had turned ashen. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose. Financial audits confirmed by Anna Kessler, internal memos provided by Ellen Brooks, digital communications recovered by Leo Tran. The corruption network, that had seemed impenetrable, now displayed its vulnerabilities under the harsh light of scrutiny. The judge's composure cracked during cross-examination. Karoline approached methodically, questions precisely targeted to exploit the fractures in his denials. "And who authorized the transfer of judicial discretionary funds into the Manchester Development Coalition?" she pressed. Harrington's hand trembled slightly as he reached for water. "The allocation was approved through standard channels." "Standard channels that required Sentinel's approval, correct?" The courtroom fell silent. This was the first public mention of Sentinel, the shadowy orchestrator whose existence had been only whispered about until now. Harrington realized his mistake instantly. His eyes darted to the courtroom doors where two unfamiliar men in suits had appeared. "I didn't. That's not what I meant to." For clarification, Karoline continued relentlessly. "Are you referring to Senator Robert Dawson when you reference Sentinel?" "I invoke my Fifth Amendment rights," Harrington declared, too late to retract his inadvertent confirmation of the network's mastermind. The men at the door moved forward now, badges emerging from suit pockets. FBI agents, their presence unknown even to Karoline until this moment. "Gerald Harrington," the lead agent announced, "you are under arrest for judicial corruption, racketeering, and conspiracy against the United States." Chaos erupted as Harrington was escorted from his own courtroom in handcuffs. Reporters rushed toward exits to file breaking stories. Community members embraced, some openly weeping at the fall of the man who had enabled their displacement. Karoline stood momentarily still amid the tumult, meeting Nicholas's gaze across the room. This victory, while significant, was merely tactical. Senator Dawson's sentinel remained untouched, and his resources were vast. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured the historic perp walk as Harrington was led to a waiting federal vehicle. Marcus Tate had organized community members into lines along the courthouse steps, their silent presence forming a gauntlet of accountability through which the disgraced judge was forced to walk. "This is just the beginning," Karoline told Jasmine Carter as they watched Harrington's vehicle depart. "Sentinel will retaliate with everything he has." Jasmine nodded gravely. "But now the public knows he exists. Shadows lose their power when exposed to light." Across town, Senator Robert Dawson watched the courthouse footage on a private feed, his expression unreadable. A phone rang, a secure line used only for emergencies. "Containment has failed," the voice reported. Harrington mentioned Sentinel in open court. Dawson's response was chillingly measured. "Then we no longer need to be subtle." The battle had been won, but Karoline knew the war was escalating. As she descended the courthouse steps into a sea of microphones and cameras, the weight of what lay ahead pressed upon her. Yet in this moment, justice had prevailed against corruption that had once seemed untouchable. Manchester would never be the same. Neither would Karoline Leavitt. And somewhere in the corridors of power, Sentinel was already planning his countermove. The fall of Judge Harrington marked not an end, but a beginning. As federal agents escorted the disgraced jurist from the courthouse he once ruled, Karoline Leavitt knew that the true architect of Manchester's corruption remained at large. The name Sentinel had finally been spoken aloud in that courtroom, a phantom given form. And with it, Senator Robert Dawson's carefully constructed world of shadows began to crack. While cameras captured Harrington's downfall, Karoline retreated to the war room, established in Nicholas Riccio's downtown office building. Maps of political connections covered the walls, financial flowcharts linked shell companies to legitimate enterprises, and at the center of this web, Senator Dawson's photograph. "The Bureau has launched a full investigation into Dawson's network," Anna Kessler reported, her federal credentials providing unprecedented access to ongoing operations. "They've frozen 17 accounts linked to Liberty Vanguard overnight," Jasmine Carter nodded, typing furiously. "My sources confirm subpoenas are being prepared for 3 of Dawson's closest aides." Karoline surveyed the assembled allies. David Walsh, still looking over his shoulder despite Harrington's arrest. Ellen Brooks, whose provided documents had proven pivotal. Leo Tran, who had cracked encryption that revealed the network's digital architecture. And Marcus Tate, whose community organizing had transformed public opinion. "Sentinel won't surrender quietly," Karoline cautioned them. "Dawson has spent decades building political armor. Harrington was but one piece of a machine that extends through judges, regulators, and legislators across 3 states. Across town, the Manchester Tribune ran 72-point headlines declaring judicial corruption exposed, while community centers in neighborhoods once threatened by Liberty Vanguard's development schemes erupted in celebration. Marcus Tate had transformed these victories into momentum for the newly established Leavitt Justice Fund, a watchdog organization dedicated to monitoring political finance in Manchester County. "Today we celebrate," Marcus told the crowded room at community headquarters. "But tomorrow we watch. Every donation, every contract, every judicial appointment. Scrutiny is our weapon now." The anticipated retaliation came swiftly. Senator Dawson appeared on 3 national networks, denouncing what he called a, quote, "partisan witch hunt" and, quote, "character assassination." His allies in conservative media circulated rumors about Karoline's past cases, attempting to reframe her as an ambitious prosecutor with political aspirations. Nicholas Riccio weathered sudden regulatory inspections of his business interests. "They're probing for vulnerabilities," he told Karoline, in the privacy of their home, security sweeps now a daily ritual. "Dawson still controls enough regulatory authority to create problems." Karoline nodded, the weight of their struggle evident in the new security details stationed outside, in the encrypted communications now standard among their team, in the careful screening of new allies after Sarah Nuwan's betrayal. "We knew the cost when we started this," she replied, steel in her voice. In Washington, Senator Dawson maintained his public persona of aggrieved innocence while privately directing a campaign of obstruction. Whistleblowers found themselves investigated by their own departments. Evidence faced procedural challenges in multiple jurisdictions. The machinery of containment worked with cold efficiency. Yet something had fundamentally changed in Manchester. Citizens emerged from apathy into vigilance. Neighborhood watches monitored development sites. Citizen journalists packed zoning board meetings. The corruption that had once operated with impunity now faced 1,000 watchful eyes. "They're gathering outside the federal building again," Jasmine reported one morning, showing Karoline footage of hundreds of Manchester residents holding signs demanding accountability. This isn't fading away like Dawson predicted. Late one evening, as Karoline reviewed case documents, a secure message arrived from Anna Kessler. Financial traces confirmed. Dawson's Sentinel identity verified on 3 separate offshore transfers. FBI, moving to next phase. The fight had evolved beyond a local corruption scandal into a federal investigation of historic proportions. Karoline's evidence had become the foundation for cases spanning multiple jurisdictions, each revelation spawning new investigative threads. This was never about one judge or one development project. Karoline addressed her expanded team of allies. This is about whether power can operate without accountability, whether justice applies equally to those who write the laws as to those who live under them. In Senator Dawson's Washington office, the pressure mounted visibly. Staff resignations accumulated. Allies maintained public support but distanced themselves privately. The invincible political machine that had operated for decades began showing stress fractures under sustained scrutiny. Karoline Leavitt moved through Manchester, not as a conqueror, but as a sentinel herself, watchful, resolute, prepared. The path forward remained dangerous, with Dawson's resources still substantial and his desperation growing. Yet she no longer walked alone. A movement had formed around the simple principle she had championed, that truth, however inconvenient to power, must prevail. "We've only begun to understand how deep this network extends," she told Nicholas as they reviewed new evidence. "But they've begun to understand something too, that we will not stop." The battle for Manchester's soul continued, but its citizens now fought with opened eyes, their collective courage matching Karoline's own relentless determination to confront corruption's uppermost reaches, no matter the cost, no matter how powerful the adversary. Karoline Leavitt's relentless crusade against a vast corruption network reveals that truth and justice demand unyielding courage, collective strength and vigilance. In today's polarized society, exposing hidden power requires not only evidence but unity and trust amid betrayal and intimidation. Her journey exemplifies that fighting entrenched corruption is far from a solo endeavor. It is a communal struggle, grounded in faith, resilience, and the unbreakable will to protect democracy's foundations. The story serves as a resonant call to all who seek transparency and accountability. Stand firm, rise together, and never let fear silence the truth.